what am I going to cover? Just a little bit more about myself. The most important slide in today's presentation is the one about religious perspectives, because there are two completely different ways of thinking about religion and understanding religion. And then I want to look at the history and try to measure the relationship between these three religious faiths, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, looking both at things that you can actually measure and count, and what I think is more important, what people really believe. And then finally, I've got some recommended reading for you. So me. The most important thing about this slide is not the picture or the tie, it's the address of my website at the bottom, where you can find more information than you will ever want to know about me, and also some of my previous writings and talks about religion. And I'm recording today's talk, which will also end up on my website eventually. So different ways of thinking about and understanding religion. And these are fundamentally distinct. From an academic perspective, God is only something that you're interested in from the point of view of what is it that people have to say about God. The idea of God's actually existing and intervening in human history is simply out of scope from an academic perspective. If you find a religious text that predicts a real historical event in detail, so you're sure that the text is talking about this historical event, then to an academic, that means immediately that the religious text must have been written after the event it's talking about. Because to an academic, human beings have no ability to predict the future. A real God is sort of out of scope, and therefore the text must have been written after the event. The perspective of a religious believer is, of course, completely different. I believe in the existence of God. I believe that God has the power to tell a person what is going to happen in the future if God wants to do that. And God can directly communicate religious texts either by inspiring them or by literally giving the exact words of the text to a person. So these are completely different ways of understanding and thinking about religion. The academic perspective, of course, comes very naturally to an atheist, somebody who doesn't believe in God anyway. What's more challenging is if a religious believer wants to engage in an academic discussion with an academic, because you have to stop seeing the world through your own eyes as a religious believer, switch off part of that, and focus entirely on the same arguments as the academic is going to use and understand. So two completely different ways of seeing the world. And unless you know whether you're speaking from an academic perspective or a believer's perspective, you will end up having a dialogue of the deaf. So a bit of academic history. Very small part of the world there, covering Western Arabia and part of the Middle East, Palestine. Tiny little part of the world. And yet, the religions of every bit of the world, apart from the areas I've colored red, come from that tiny little part of the world. The religion of Europe, North America, South America, virtually all of Africa, Australasia, either Christianity or Islam with a bit of Judaism. There aren't that many Jews in the world, about 14 million, that's all. But over 2 billion Muslims, over 2 billion Christians, about a billion and a half Muslims, And even in the areas that are coloured red, you find massive Christian and Muslim population in China, in India, growing Christian presence in Korea, for example. So, an amazing piece of history if you think about it, for that tiny little region to be the source of basically almost all of humanity's religious belief. And it all begins with Abraham. A historian can't actually prove whether or not there ever was a real person called Abraham. But if you look at the religious texts of Christianity, Judaism, Islam, they have basically the same message. That God spoke to a person called Abraham, told him to leave his family and move to where God told him to move, and God made promises to him. So already we see two alternative ways of thinking about the world. And it's impossible to understand one of these religions without thinking about the other two. And the history is quite clear. Judaism is by far the oldest religion. Christianity is a direct offshoot of Judaism. And Islam is an offshoot of both of them. And if you look at the world in which Islam originated, around 600 AD, it was a world dominated by Christianity, major Christian presence in both Africa, Anatolia, that was now modern Turkey, Iraq, major Jewish presence in Iraq, in the Yemen, etc. And that was the environment in which Islam originated. And from an academic's perspective, it was quite clear. Islam is a development, an outgrowth out of Christianity and Judaism. And now I want to look a bit more closely at these three religions in terms of their relationships to each other. And this title, Triangulating, I picked that because it's my personal background. I did a degree in mathematics at Cambridge, and so thinking geometrically comes naturally to me. And I had a tour of Lambeth Palace the first time I went there, given by a senior Christian cleric. It wasn't the Archbishop of Canterbury, but it was somebody quite senior who worked for him. He showed me around Lambeth Palace, and then he brought me lunch at a nearby restaurant. And he said something to me which really surprised me. And this diagram summarizes what he said to me, which was that, in his view, Christianity and Judaism were very close to each other, and that Islam was very different from both of them. And that shocked me, because it completely contradicted everything I had believed for decades. And when somebody's bought you lunch, you don't get into a fight with them. But I went away intent on writing a refutation of what he'd said. It took me about a year before I had a handwritten draft, and another year before I got round to publishing it. But it's on my website as Triangulating the Abrahamic Faiths. And I want to go through some of the principles of what I've written now. So let's start with what you can measure. And if you look at what you can measure, you can understand where this man was coming from. So let's begin with religious texts. Every Christian, in principle, carries around a Bible, his religious text, but in that Bible are 100% of the key religious texts that a Jew believes in, namely what the Christian calls the Old Testament, and what the Jew will call the Tanakh. That's an abbreviation in Hebrew for Torah, Nebiim, and Ketubim, the law, the prophets, and the writings. But exactly the same books, just in a different order. The last book of the Old Testament in a Christian Bible is the book of Malachi. It's a very short book. Malachi is not the last book of a set of Jewish scriptures in English. Malachi comes sort of maybe halfway through, because one of the prophets, and the writings come at the end, the way that the Jews sequence them. But it's the same books. Whereas the Quran, there's no overlap. There isn't a single page of the Quran in the Bible, and there isn't a single page of the Bible in the Quran, even though there's a lot of overlap of some of the content. So if you look at it from that point of view, you can see exactly why this Christian thought what he did. Similarly, if you look at prophets, I've got here some of the prophets mentioned in the Old Testament. Malachi, who I mentioned before, Haggai, Obadiah. You may not have heard those names. You will have heard the names of Noah and Abraham, Moses, and so on. So those are the Old Testament prophets. I said it's not a full list, it's just a partial list. Then you take the New Testament and you add Jesus. Jesus is what's new about Christianity. And of course, Christianity doesn't refer to Jesus as a prophet. It refers to him very differently, as we'll see later on. But nevertheless, Jesus is what you add on from a Christian perspective. Then if you look at Islam, well, it's quite interesting what the Quran has to say, because the Quran also talks about Jesus, Noah, Adam, Abraham, but it mentions some other prophets, Muhammad, and other prophets that non-Muslims have almost never heard of, like Hud and Salah and Shuaib. What's interesting about the Quran is who it talks about most. Because the person who is mentioned by name most in the Quran isn't Muhammad. It's actually Moses, followed by Abraham and Jesus. They get far more coverage in the Quran than Muhammad gets. These are the numbers. I counted them using technology. But if you stop there, that Christian guy, might have been right, but I think it misses the point, because religion isn't about counting pages of scripture. It's not even about counting the number of times a prophet might get mentioned. It's about what you believe. And when you look at what you believe, you get a very, very different picture. So what do these religions have to say about God, for example? Judaism. The most important prayer in Judaism, the heart of it, is referred to as the Shema, which is just the Hebrew first word. It means hear. Shema Israel. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. That is the essence of Judaism, the oneness of God. And it's exactly the same as the oneness of God in Islam. Muslims and Jews are crystal clear about the unique identity of God and his oneness. The Christian perspective is actually very different. And for Christianity, I've gone to the Roman Catholic Church for two reasons. First of all, it's by far and away the largest single Christian group. And secondly, they've got a very convenient website for the Vatican where you can go and find this material, and you can be sure you're saying exactly what the church actually believes and thinks. And this is a very different perspective on the nature of God. Now, Muslims, and indeed Jews, will sometimes criticize Christians saying they don't really believe in one God, they believe in three. Trinitarianism. It's more complicated than that. Because from a Christian perspective, essentially God is the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, but all three of them at the same time. I don't know how many of you have studied physics yet, but in physics, light has both wave characteristics and it has particle characteristics. And it doesn't have those characteristics at different times. It has them both at the same time. Light is both a wave and a particle at the same time. And in the same way in Christianity, God is the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, and God is one at the same time. A Christian will get very upset if you say to him he believes in three gods, or that he's not a monotheist. But Christians understand monotheism in a different way from the way that Muslims and Jews understand monotheism. Fundamentally different. Jesus. From a Christian perspective, Jesus is God. This is the Vatican Roman Catholic belief. Not all Christians believe that. Look at the early history of Christianity. For hundreds of years, Christians argued enormously about whether Jesus was all man, or whether he was all God, whether he was part man and part God, or whether he was both at the same time. But this is where the church finally settled. It's called the Nicene Creed because it's named after the Council of Nicaea, which took place from memory in 325 AD. So Christians at that stage decided, or the majority, what they felt about the nature of Jesus. But it's fundamentally different from what Muslims believe and understand to be the nature of Jesus. Because while Muslims believe it, because the Quran says it, that Jesus had a virgin birth, from a Muslim perspective, Jesus was no more divine than me or you. Totally just a man. And Jesus never wanted anybody to worship him. Jesus only worshipped God. So a fundamentally different perspective from a Muslim compared to a Christian about Jesus. And Judaism doesn't really talk about Jesus very much. First of all the key religious texts of Judaism, the Holy Scriptures, they were all written long before Jesus came along. He does get a mention in the Talmud, potentially. The Talmud is a collection of Jewish rabbinic writings that were put together starting about 100 BC and finishing about sort of 300 or 400 AD. But it's not clear, and in any event, there's no special role for Jesus in Judaism at all. He's basically ignored. But if you ask a Jew, was Jesus man or God, you'll get an instant, straightforward, clear answer. If Jesus existed, he was a man. Full stop. So Islam and Judaism saying exactly the same thing about Jesus in terms of his nature. Christianity is something very different. Salvation. How do you get to heaven? The fundamental Christian belief is that you get to heaven because Jesus died for you. That is the essence of the teaching of the church. Yes, the church wants you to behave well, do good things, and not do bad things, but that isn't what gets you to heaven. What gets you to heaven is having faith in Jesus and believing that Jesus died for you. Judaism and Islam, fundamentally different. Essentially, it's down to you and behaving well while recognizing that none of us are perfect. And on the day of judgment, God assesses your life, whether you behave well or badly, and you get either a tick or a cross. Fundamentally different from the Christian perspective. Exclusivism. Who is capable of going to heaven? There's a doctrine in Christianity, in the Catholic Church. The shorthand name for it is outside the church, there is no salvation. And this is part of the Catechism. What it's essentially saying is that if you have the opportunity, if you're told about Christianity and you choose not to accept it, you've had it. They don't talk about this very much because it sounds nasty, but is the essence of the position of the church. The Muslim position is quite different. The Quran is quite clear. those who've attained to faith in this divine writ, that's Muslims. Muslims, Christians, Jews, and Sabaeans, they're a long-lost religious group from Arabia. Provided they do good things, provided they believe in God, on the day of judgment, they don't need to be afraid. That's the Muslim perspective. The Jewish perspective, very similar. Jews have lots of rules that apply to Jews from Judaism. They have called mitzvot, commandments, and I think there are about 630 of them. But for non-Jews, for Gentiles, there are only 7 laws called Noahide laws because they relate back to Noah and they're for Gentiles. And provided you follow the Noahide laws, you are a good person in the eyes of God. So again, a very, very different perspective from the Christian perspective that outside the church there is no salvation. I could go on, but I'm not going to go into item after item after item. But the eventual picture you get to is a very different triangle from the triangle that my Christian priest was talking about. And Judaism and Islam are very, very close to each other. In fact, if I was asked for a very, very, very short description, I would say that Islam is basically Judaism without the chosen people. Because while there are loads of differences about what Muslims do or don't do, so for example, Jews don't eat prawns, but Muslims can eat prawns, those are irrelevant details. If you look at what Judaism and Islam say about the nature of God, the nature of man, how to live a good life, heaven and hell, essentially negligible difference between them. But Islam is a universal religion. It doesn't have any kind of concept of a chosen people. Christianity is very different from both of them. But I put Christianity nearer to Islam than to Judaism for one fundamental reason, and that is Jesus and the virgin birth. Because Muslims do believe in the virgin birth, Jews categorically don't. So I promise you some reading material. If you're going to understand a religion, there is no better way than to engage and read its religious text. Not many people these days try to read the Bible from cover to cover, but it can be done, and it's not hard. I did it in my 20s. And the version I read, the New English Bible, was brand new at the time. It's since been revised to something called the Revised English Bible. And if you want to read a Bible, that is the one that I recommend. And I do recommend reading it. This book by Robin Lane Fox is about the academic understanding of the Bible and how academics think that the religious texts in what's called the Old Testament and indeed the New Testament came about. Because there was a time before the New Testament existed, for example. Christians got together and they had to agree which writings were part of the New Testament and which writings were not going to be included in the New Testament. That was a real decision taken by real people in history. Again, I recommend reading the Quran. And this particular version by Abdul Halim came out in 2006, really is readable. You can start at page 1 and keep going until you get to the end. It's in modern English, very easy to understand, and very few footnotes, which is why I recommend it. Just read it from cover to cover. If you want to study the Quran, I recommend a different version, which has lots of footnotes and lots of guidance about the Quran. But if you just want to start by reading it, which is where I think you should start, Abdul Halim's is the one I would start with. And these slides that I'm skipping through, any of you who wants these slides can get them from your school later on. And to understand Judaism, in my early 20s, I read a book by Herman Wouk, who's an American Jewish writer. His most famous book is called The Cain Mutiny, which was made into an extremely famous film. But he wrote this book, This Is My God, to explain what it means to be a Jew and the Jewish way of life. Very, very readable. It's still in print decades later. the history of Islam, Tom Holland's book, The Shadow of the Sword, about half of that is about the Eastern Roman Empire, a period of history I knew next to nothing about until I started reading the book. Then he covers the rise of Islam. Again, very, very readable, very informative. And this 700-page blockbuster by Hans Kung about Islam, the reason I recommend that is that if a Muslim says nice things about Islam, you'd expect that. What else is he going to say? But when a Roman Catholic theologian says nice things about Islam, it's worth paying some attention. And it's a very, very informative book. And then this book by Reza Aslan came out only a few years ago, and it's about the historical Jesus. It's based upon as much detailed history as one can find, but written from a Muslim perspective rather than from a Christian perspective. And there's quite a famous video you can find on YouTube where he's being interviewed by a Fox News presenter, and she's basically trying to say that because he's a Muslim, he's not entitled to write about Jesus, and he tears her to pieces brilliantly. It's worth finding that on YouTube, if nothing else. So with that, over to you for questions and answers.